I still remember the sharp sting in my chest the moment I realized my daughter had taken credit for everything during our family trip, and that the check I signed, the one they all applauded her for, was actually mine to pay. I sat there, invisible and betrayed, while everyone cheered her name. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share, and if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning starts with the sun peeking through my dusty Chicago apartment's faded curtains, the sound of honking cars and distant chatter threading through the humid summer air. The scent of old leather and coffee mingles with the faint whir of the old radiator that's been my companion for 23 years now. My days blur together like watercolors in the rain, cooking meals that no one calls to ask about, cleaning spaces that no one visits, folding laundry that smells of loneliness and detergent. That particular morning in June, I sat by my kitchen window, fingers wrapped around my chipped ceramic mug, the one with the faded roses that Dana gave me for Mother's Day 15 years ago. I was nervously waiting for my daughter's call, the one that would confirm the final details of our family trip. The trip I had quietly financed by selling my mother's pearl necklace, the one with the tiny diamonds that caught light like promises. Months earlier, when Dana first mentioned wanting to plan something special for the family, I had felt that familiar flutter in my chest. Hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time I wouldn't be the afterthought, the convenient solution to everyone's problems. So I pushed my thin savings aside, walked into that pawn shop on North Clark Street with trembling hands, and watched a stranger weigh the only valuable thing my mother had left me. But the call never came that morning. Instead, I stared at the glossy brochure she'd tossed carelessly on my kitchen counter during her last visit. The luxury weekend getaway. All expenses paid by Dana. My stomach dropped. All expenses paid by Dana. There it was, printed in elegant script, my daughter's name taking credit for sacrifices she'd never made. I had dreamed this trip would be a new beginning, a chance to feel like I mattered again. But as the weekend unfolded, so did a realization as cold and sharp as the lake breeze that rattles my windows every winter night. Let me take you back to understand how I got here. Let me tell you about the years of small betrayals that prepared me for this biggest one of all. I remember when Dana was 7, curled up against my chest with a fever that wouldn't break. I sang her lullabies until my voice cracked, stroked her hair until my arms went numb. "I love you, Mommy," she whispered in her small, hoarse voice. Those were the days when my love felt returned, when my sacrifices felt seen. But children grow up, and somewhere along the way, love becomes expectation, and gratitude becomes entitlement. When Dana started college, I worked double shifts at Morrison's Deli downtown, my hands cracked and bleeding from the cold cuts and the harsh sanitizers. The smell of pastrami and pickle brine became my perfume, the ache in my lower back, my constant companion. Every paycheck went toward her tuition, her books, her spring break trips that she never invited me to. "I'm building my future, Mom," she'd say during our brief phone calls. "You understand, right?" I understood. I always understood, even when understanding felt like swallowing glass. The pattern continued after college. Dana's wedding, a lavish affair in Lincoln Park that cost me my small retirement fund. "But it's my special day, Mom. You want it to be perfect, don't you?" The down payment on our house in Evanston. There went my emergency savings. "It's an investment in the family's future, Mom. We'll pay you back." The promise hung in the air like morning fog, beautiful but quick to disappear. Each time, I told myself this was love. This was what mothers did. We gave until we had nothing left to give, and then we found more to give anyway. But the thank yous became shorter, the visits less frequent, the phone calls more purposeful. I wasn't Dana anymore. I was a problem to be solved, a resource to be tapped, a guilt to be managed. My son Michael followed the same pattern. When his startup needed capital, guess who had a little money saved from picking up extra shifts? When his car broke down, who co-signed the loan? When his girlfriend needed a place to stay for just a few weeks that turned into 8 months, whose couch became her bed? "You're so generous, Mrs. Patterson," she used to say, eating my food, using my utilities, never offering to help with groceries. Michael would pat my shoulder awkwardly. "Mom's always been there for us," he'd tell her. like I was a piece of reliable furniture rather than a person with feelings and needs. And my youngest, Tommy, sweet Tommy, who I thought would be different. But even he learned the family language of emotional manipulation. "Mom, you know I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important," became his opening line for every financial request. The guitar lessons, the computer for school, the security deposit for his first apartment. Each time, I said yes. Each time, I watched a little more of my dignity disappear. But it wasn't just the money. Money was just the symptom. The real disease was deeper, more painful. It was the way they looked through me at family gatherings, their eyes sliding past like I was wallpaper. It was the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the inside jokes I was never included in, the group text chains I discovered by accident, full of plans made without me. Christmas morning became a performance. I'd sit in my corner chair, watching my children open gifts I'd bought and wrapped, hearing them thank Santa or each other or anyone but me. "Oh, this is nice," Dana would say about the sweater I'd saved 3 weeks to afford. "Where did it come from?" As if it had materialized from thin air, as if my hands hadn't shaken while handing over my credit card at Macy's. The loneliness was suffocating, but the worst part was how they made me question my own reality. When I'd express hurt at being forgotten on my birthday, Dana would sigh dramatically. "Mom, we're all so busy. You can't expect us to remember everything." When I'd mention feeling left out of family decisions, Michael would roll his eyes. "You're being too sensitive. We're adults now. We don't need to include you in everything." Too sensitive. The phrase haunted my sleepless nights. Maybe I was asking for too much. Maybe wanting to feel valued by your own children was selfish. Maybe the problem wasn't them. Maybe it was me. The doubt crept in like Chicago winter fog, thick and disorienting. I began to second-guess every conversation, every reaction, every moment of pain. Was I imagining the slights? Was I manufacturing drama where none existed? The questions multiplied in the quiet rooms of my apartment, echoing off walls that held no answers. Then came my 65th birthday. I woke up hopeful, phone in hand, waiting for the calls that would make me feel remembered. The morning stretched into afternoon into evening. Finally, at 9 o'clock, Dana texted, "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry, crazy day. Call you tomorrow." She never did. 3 days later, I ended up in the emergency room with chest pains that the doctors eventually diagnosed as a panic attack. "Do you have support at home?" the young nurse asked kindly. I lied and said yes. The truth, that I could disappear for days without anyone noticing, seemed too humiliating to speak aloud. When Dana finally heard about my hospital visit, it was through a casual mention from Tommy a week later. Her response was quick and practiced. "Why didn't you call me? I would have come." But she wouldn't have. We both knew it. The performance of caring had become more important than caring itself. That's when the family trip idea surfaced. Dana brought it up during one of her rare visits, sitting at my kitchen table, drumming her manicured nails against the worn formica. "We should do something special as a family. A real vacation, you know? Somewhere nice. It would be so good for all of us to reconnect." My heart leaped. This was it. The olive branch I'd been waiting for. Finally, I would have my children's attention, their presence, their time. We'd sit around dinner tables and share stories. We'd walk along beaches or through museums, making memories that would carry us through the lonely months ahead. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Where were you thinking?" Dana's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen directed at me in years. "I was thinking Door County. You know those cute little towns up in Wisconsin? There's this amazing resort I found online. It's not cheap, but it would be so worth it." Not cheap. The words hung between us like a bridge I was expected to cross. I knew what came next without her having to say it. I'd seen this dance before. "Well," I said carefully, "it sounds lovely. How were you planning to— what's the budget looking like?" Dana's face shifted slightly, the enthusiasm dimming just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. "I thought we could all chip in, you know? Pool our resources. Make it a real family investment." But we both knew who would end up footing the bill. We both knew who always did. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, a pile of bills, and my bank statement spread out like tarot cards predicting my financial future. The resort Dana had chosen cost more than I made in 3 months. The rooms, the meals, the activities. It would require every penny I had saved, plus selling something valuable. My mother's necklace sat in its small velvet box on the table beside me. I opened it gently, watching the diamonds catch the overhead light. My mother had worn it on her wedding day, kept it through the depression, polished it lovingly every Sunday after church. "This is for you, Maggie," she'd whispered on her deathbed. "Something beautiful for when you need to remember you're worth beautiful things." I sold it 3 days later. The pawn shop owner was kind enough, explaining that vintage pieces weren't as valuable as people hoped. Still, the money was enough. Barely, but enough. I walked home clutching the cash in my purse, feeling like I'd traded a piece of my soul for my children's tolerance. Dana was thrilled when I told her I could contribute to the trip. "Oh, Mom, this is going to be amazing. I have so many ideas. We'll do wine tastings, and there's this incredible spa and boat tours of the lake. I'll take care of all the planning. You just relax and enjoy." "I'll take care of all the planning." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they filled me with unease I couldn't quite name. Over the next few weeks, Dana threw herself into organizing our getaway, with an energy that made me feel hopeful and nervous in equal measure. She sent group texts about activities and reservations. She researched restaurants and made dinner plans. She booked spa treatments and wine tours with the efficiency of a professional travel agent. But I noticed something strange in those group messages. My name was never mentioned. The plans were always presented as Dana's family vacation, the activities as Dana's arrangements, the hotel and restaurant reservations under Dana's party. When Tommy asked in the group chat who had booked the fancy restaurant for our last night, Dana replied, "I took care of it. Can't wait for you all to experience this place I found." The place I found, with the money from my mother's necklace. I told myself I was overthinking. Dana was just excited, just proud of her organizational skills. Maybe she'd forgotten in her enthusiasm that the trip wouldn't be possible without my contribution. Maybe she'd give me credit when we were all together, when the moment felt right. But deep down, in the part of my heart that had been bruised too many times to trust easily anymore, I knew better. The morning we left for Door County, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. When had the lines around my eyes become so deep? When had my shoulders started curving inward like I was protecting myself from blows that never stopped coming? I smoothed my best blouse, the navy one with tiny flowers that Dana had complimented years ago, and forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. The drive up was beautiful. Lake Michigan stretched endlessly to our right, its surface sparkling like scattered coins in the afternoon sun. Dana chatted excitedly from the passenger seat while Michael drove, pointing out landmarks she'd researched, sharing trivia about the towns we passed through. Tommy dozed in the back seat beside me, his earbuds in, his head lolling against the window. "This is going to be so perfect," Dana said for the 100th time, turning to flash me a smile that seemed genuine. "I can't believe I pulled this all together. Wait until you see the hotel, Mom. The pictures online don't do it justice." I pulled this all together. Again, no mention of my contribution, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice that made this possible. I stared out the window and tried to convince myself it didn't matter. We were together. That's what mattered. The hotel was indeed beautiful. A sprawling resort perched on a bluff overlooking the lake, with manicured gardens and a wraparound porch that belonged in a magazine. Dana checked us in with the confidence of someone accustomed to luxury, chatting easily with the desk clerk about upgraded rooms and late checkout times. "Everything's taken care of," she announced as she handed out key cards. "Dinner reservations, spa appointments, tomorrow's wine tour. I've got it all covered." She'd never organized anything this elaborate before. Not for her own birthdays, not for her wedding, not for any family event I could remember. But here she was, orchestrating our weekend with the precision of someone who'd been planning luxury vacations her entire life. That first evening, we gathered in the hotel's elegant dining room. The table was set with heavy silverware and crystal glasses that caught the light from the massive chandelier overhead. Dana had requested the best table, with views of the lake through floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything was perfect, exquisite, expensive. I should have felt grateful. I should have felt proud of my daughter's attention to detail, her desire to give us all a memorable experience. Instead, I felt like an ATM that had been dressed up and invited to dinner. The meal was extraordinary, course after course of beautifully presented food that cost more per plate than I usually spent on groceries in a week. Dana held court, explaining each dish, recommending wine pairings, playing the role of gracious hostess with impressive skill. "My daughter has such sophisticated taste," I overheard Michael telling the woman at the table next to us. "She really knows how to do things right." My daughter, her sophisticated taste, her ability to do things right. All true, all earned with my mother's diamonds. When the check came, and I knew it would be substantial, Dana reached for it with practiced confidence. "Let me take care of this," she said, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "This whole weekend is my treat to the family," she signed with a flourish, adding a generous tip that made the waiter beam with gratitude. "Thank you so much, Miss Patterson," he said. "It's been such a pleasure serving your party tonight." Miss Patterson, the woman who had treated her family to an unforgettable evening, the woman who had signed the check with such easy generosity. I excused myself and went to the ladies' room, where I stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror and tried to understand what I was feeling. Anger seemed too strong. Disappointment too weak. It was something deeper, more corrosive. The slow-burning ache of being erased from my own story. That night, I lay in my carefully appointed room, listening to the lake waves through the open window, and wondered when I had become so invisible to my own children that they could take credit for my sacrifices without even noticing they were doing it. The pattern continued throughout the weekend. At the wine tasting, Dana introduced herself to the sommelier as the organizer of our group, accepting compliments on her excellent choice of vineyard. During the spa day, she graciously thanked the staff for accommodating her party with such short notice. At every restaurant, she signed every check, accumulated every thank you, basked in every compliment about her generosity and good taste. I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own vacation. The breaking point came on our final night. Dana had reserved a private dining room at the resort's most exclusive restaurant, a space that typically required a month's advance booking and a credit card guarantee that made my stomach clench. The room was intimate and elegant, with a view of the lake at sunset, and a table set for 5 with the kind of attention to detail that whispered money in ways I'd never been able to afford. As we settled into our seats, Dana raised her wine glass with the confidence of someone accustomed to making toasts. "I want to say something," she began, her voice carrying the slight tremor of emotion that I recognized from her college graduation speech. "This weekend has been so important to me, being able to bring my family together like this, to show you all how much you mean to me. It's something I'll treasure forever." Michael raised his glass. "To Dana, for making this incredible weekend possible." Tommy, more awake than he'd been all trip, chimed in. "Seriously, sis, this place is amazing. You really outdid yourself." Even my ex-husband Robert, who had joined us for this final dinner, lifted his wine glass with approval. "Your daughter knows how to live well," he said to me with a smile that felt like a knife twist. "You should be proud." The praise continued, each compliment adding another layer to Dana's growing legend as the family's generous benefactor. She glowed under the attention, accepting each thank you with gracious modesty that would have been admirable if it had been deserved. "I just wanted us to have beautiful memories together," she said, dabbing at her eyes with her cloth napkin. "That's worth any expense. Any expense. Paid with my mother's necklace." I sat there, wine glass trembling in my hand, watching my life savings being credited to my daughter's account with gratitude and admiration. The room was filled with laughter and warm conversation, but I felt like I was drowning in plain sight. When Dana excused herself to powder her nose, I followed her out of the dining room, my heart pounding with the courage of desperation. I found her in the elegant hallway, checking her lipstick in a gilt-framed mirror. "Dana," I said quietly, "can I talk to you for a moment?" She turned, eyebrows raised with the patient expression she'd perfected for tiresome interruptions. "What is it, Mom? We should get back. They're about to serve dessert." "This weekend," I began, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "It's been wonderful, really, but I was hoping—" I mean, people keep thanking you, and I just thought what? Her tone had sharpened, the warmth from the dining room evaporating like morning dew. Well, I contributed to this too. The hotel, the restaurants, all of it. I sold my mother's necklace to help make this possible, and I just thought maybe you could mention that. Not for credit, but just so they know. Dana's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, something that looked like pity mixed with irritation. Mom, you're being dramatic. Yes, you helped with the expenses. We all did. But I'm the one who organized everything. I'm the one who made the reservations, planned the activities, coordinated everyone's schedules. That's worth something too, isn't it? Of course it is. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying, you're saying you want credit for writing a check? She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt more threatening than shouting would have. That's what this is about? You want them to know you paid for dinner? Put like that, my request sounded petty, grasping, pathetic, which I realized was exactly how she intended it to sound. It's not about credit, I said weakly. It's about feeling like I matter. Like I'm part of this family instead of just what, Mom? Just the bank account. The words hung between us like a slap. Dana's face hardened, her eyes going cold in a way that reminded me startlingly of her father during our worst fights. Nobody asked you to pay for anything, she said quietly. You offered. You insisted, actually. And now you want to ruin everyone's good time because you're having buyer's remorse? I'm not trying to ruin anything. You want attention. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You can't stand that I'm getting praised for something, so you have to make it about you. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, delivered with the surgical precision that only comes from knowing exactly where someone is most vulnerable. I felt my courage crumbling, my righteous anger dissolving into the familiar shame of being difficult, demanding, ungrateful. That's not... I started, then stopped. What was the point? She'd twisted my simple request for acknowledgement into proof of my selfishness. She'd made my desire to be seen into evidence of my pettiness. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I'd walked right into it. Let's go back, Dana said briskly, her hostess smile sliding back into place like a mask. We don't want to keep everyone waiting. I followed her back to the dining room, where the others were laughing over some story Michael was telling. They barely noticed our absence, too caught up in the warm glow of good food and family bonding to register the tension crackling between Dana and me. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of forced smiles and mechanical responses. I nodded at the right moments, laughed when laughter was expected, participated in the illusion of family harmony while feeling more alone than I had in years. When the final check came, larger than any single expense I'd ever incurred in my 68 years, Dana signed it with the same theatrical flourish she'd used all weekend. The waiter thanked her profusely for her generosity. The hostess complimented her on choosing such a special way to celebrate with her family. Even the busboy smiled at her with the warmth reserved for customers who tip like they print their own money. That night, alone in my beautiful hotel room, I sat by the window looking out at the moonlight on the lake and tried to understand what had happened to my family. When had love become a transaction? When had my children learned to take without giving, to accept without acknowledging, to see me as a resource rather than a person? And when had I started accepting it? The drive home the next morning was quiet. Everyone seemed tired, either from the weekend's indulgences or from the emotional hangover of family time that had been both wonderful and wrong in ways no one wanted to examine too closely. Donna dozed in the passenger seat, occasionally waking to murmur about what a perfect weekend it had been. Michael focused on driving, radio playing softly, his silence comfortable in the way that comes from feeling no responsibility for anyone else's feelings. Tommy was lost in his phone, scrolling through photos of the trip, probably already curating them for social media. I stared out the window at the Wisconsin countryside rolling past and realized I was looking forward to getting home to my small, quiet apartment, away from the performance of family togetherness, away from the exhausting work of pretending to be happy while being systematically erased. But the trip's aftermath was just beginning. Over the following days, the photos started appearing on social media. Dana had apparently taken hundreds of pictures throughout the weekend, candid shots of all of us laughing over wine, posed photos in front of scenic backdrops, artfully arranged pictures of our meals and hotel rooms. She captioned them with glowing descriptions of the amazing family getaway I organized and treating my loved ones to some luxury. Friends and acquaintances responded with heart emojis and comments praising her generosity. "You have such a generous heart," one wrote. "Your family is so lucky to have someone who does such thoughtful things," wrote another. Each post was like a small knife thrust, not just because she was taking credit for my sacrifice, but because she seemed to genuinely believe she deserved it. In her version of events, she was the loving daughter who had treated her family to a beautiful weekend. I was just there, a grateful recipient of her kindness. The worst part was how the story spread through our extended family. My sister Claire called, full of admiration for Dana's thoughtfulness. My cousin Janet mentioned it at church, praising my daughter for being so good to her family. Even my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Morrison, stopped me in the hallway to say how lucky I was to have such a generous child. Each compliment felt like another layer of my identity being painted over. In the growing legend of Dana's beautiful family weekend, there was no room for the quiet woman who had sold her mother's diamonds to make it possible. But it was the family dinner a month later that broke me completely. Dana had suggested we all gather at her house to keep the good feelings from our trip going. I should have been pleased. A family dinner at my daughter's house, with her cooking for all of us, was the kind of gesture I'd been hoping for years. I arrived bearing a bottle of wine and a dessert I'd spent the afternoon making, my mother's apple crisp recipe that had been my contribution to family gatherings for decades. Dana accepted them with distracted thanks, already busy orchestrating the evening with the same energy she'd brought to our weekend away. The dining room was set beautifully, with candles and flowers and the good china she'd registered for at her wedding but rarely used. Robert was there, looking comfortable and relaxed in a way that made me realize how rarely I felt that way in family settings anymore. Michael and Tommy were already deep in conversation about work and sports and the easy topics that men navigate so effortlessly. I sat in the chair Dana indicated, the one at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen. "In case we need anything," she explained with a smile that looked warm until you examined it closely. It was the same seat I'd occupied at family gatherings for years, close enough to be useful, far enough to be ignored. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed jobs and relationships and future plans with the animated energy of people who find each other genuinely interesting. I contributed when asked direct questions, but otherwise felt like an observer at someone else's family dinner. Then Robert raised his wine glass, the wine I'd brought, though no one had mentioned that, and proposed a toast. "To Dana," he said, "for bringing us all together and reminding us what family is really about. Here's to many more weekends like Door County," Michael added, raising his own glass. "That was really something special, sis." "I'm already thinking about where we could go next," Dana replied, glowing in the warm light of their appreciation. "Maybe somewhere tropical this time. I saw this resort in Florida that looked amazing." The conversation continued, everyone building on the theme of Dana's talent for creating beautiful family experiences. They reminisced about details from the trip, laughing over shared memories, planning future adventures with Dana as their benevolent organizer. I sat at the end of the table, sipping wine I'd purchased, eating food prepared in a kitchen stocked with groceries I'd helped buy over the years, listening to my family praise my daughter for experiences purchased with my mother's jewelry. And suddenly, something inside me broke. Not broke like a dramatic shattering, broke like a thread stretched too thin for too long, finally snapping with a sound only I could hear. I felt it happen, that tiny internal collapse that changes everything, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't sit in that chair at the end of the table, accepting crumbs of inclusion while watching my sacrifices get credited to other people. I couldn't smile and nod while my children rewrote history to cast themselves as generous benefactors and me as a grateful recipient. I couldn't pretend that being useful was the same as being valued. I set down my wine glass, the crystal one from the set I'd given Dana for her housewarming, and looked around the table at these people I loved more than my own life, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in years. Michael, so charming and confident, who'd learned to ask for financial help with the ease of someone ordering coffee. Tommy, sweet and scattered, who treated my assistants like public utilities, always available, never questioned, completely taken for granted. Robert, comfortable and removed, who praised Dana for qualities he'd never acknowledged in me during our 22 years of marriage. And Dana, beautiful, accomplished Dana, who'd mastered the art of accepting credit for other people's sacrifices while making them grateful for the privilege of being used. When had this happened? When had my love become a transaction, my generosity an expectation, my presence an inconvenience to be managed rather than a gift to be treasured? "I need to use the restroom," I said quietly, standing from my designated seat. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection in Dana's expensive mirror, the kind with perfect lighting that reveals every flaw while somehow making you look more like yourself than you'd prefer. The woman looking back at me was tired, defeated, smaller than I remembered being, but there was something else in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. A spark of anger, yes, but more than that. A flicker of dignity refusing to be completely extinguished. I thought about my mother's necklace, sitting in a pawn shop somewhere, probably adorning the throat of a stranger who had no idea it had once been worn by a woman who survived the Depression by refusing to give up her dreams. I thought about all the double shifts I'd worked, all the luxuries I'd foregone, all the times I'd said yes when I should have said no, just to maintain my place in my children's lives. And I realized that the place I'd been maintaining wasn't a place at all. It was a position, useful, reliable, forgettable. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation had moved on to other topics, but the energy remained the same, warm, exclusive, comfortable for everyone but me. I resumed my seat at the end of the table and finished my wine in silence, making a decision that felt like waking up after years of sleep. I was done. Not done in the dramatic way of soap opera confrontations or angry ultimatums. Done in the quiet way of a person who suddenly understands that dignity isn't negotiable and love isn't something you can purchase, no matter how much you're willing to spend. The dinner ended with the usual flurry of hugs and promises to get together soon. I helped clear the table. Of course I did, it was expected. And said my goodbyes with the kind of normal pleasantness that gives no hint of internal revolution. At home that night, I sat in my small living room surrounded by photo albums and memories, and began planning my emancipation. It started small. When Dana called the following week to ask if I could help with her mortgage payment, a temporary loan, she promised, just until some money came through at work, I said no. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd forgotten I knew. There was silence on the other end of the line, then a laugh that sounded more confused than amused. "No?" she repeated, like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "No," I said again, more firmly this time. "I can't help with that right now." "Can't or won't?" The temperature in her voice had dropped several degrees. "Won't," I said, surprising myself with my honesty. Another silence, longer this time. When Dana spoke again, her voice carried the wounded tone she'd perfected as a teenager for getting her way. "I don't understand what's wrong with you lately, Mom. Ever since the trip, you've been acting strange." Strange. As if expecting acknowledgement for my sacrifices was a personality disorder. As if wanting to be treated like a person rather than a piggy bank was a character flaw requiring correction. "Nothing's wrong with me," I said calmly. "I'm just not in a position to loan money right now." "But you loaned Michael money for his car last month." She was right, of course. I had. But Michael hadn't taken credit for organizing a luxury weekend with my money. Michael hadn't let me sit at family dinner listening to praise for generosity that wasn't his. "That was last month," I said. "This is now." I could hear her breathing change, could practically see her recalculating her approach. Dana had always been skilled at reading people, at finding the emotional buttons that opened wallets and overrode objections. "Mom, I'm worried about you. You're not acting like yourself. Maybe we should arrange for you to see someone. Talk to a professional about what you're going through." Ah, there it was. The suggestion that my sudden reluctance to finance their lives was a symptom of mental decline rather than mental clarity. It was brilliant, really. Reframe my growing backbone as evidence of cognitive problems. "I'll consider it," I said, just to end the conversation. "I have to go now, Dana. I'll talk to you soon." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and disbelief. I had just said no to my daughter. I had just refused a request for money without offering an alternative or an apology. I had just prioritized my own financial security over someone else's convenience. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. The family's response to my new boundaries was swift and predictable. Michael called with concern in his voice. Dana had spoken to him about my concerning behavior, and they thought maybe I was becoming depressed or confused. Tommy stopped by with flowers and the kind of gentle kindness you'd show someone recovering from a head injury. Even Robert got involved, calling to suggest I might benefit from spending time with people my own age, maybe joining a senior center or taking up some hobbies that would give me purpose again. Purpose. As if 50 years of supporting my family hadn't been purpose enough. What amazed me most was how quickly they'd all mobilized to address the problem of my newfound self-respect. Within a week of saying no to Dana's mortgage request, I'd received 3 phone calls expressing worry about my mental state, 2 suggestions for professional help, and 1 offer to help me reorganize my finances to make sure I wasn't making poor decisions. None of them seemed to consider that I might be making the first good decisions I'd made in years. The pressure intensified over the following weeks. Donna began dropping by unannounced, bringing groceries I didn't need, and asking probing questions about my day, my sleep, my general state of mind. Michael started including me in group texts with uplifting memes and suggestions for activities that might lift my spirits. They were killing me with kindness. The kind of concerned kindness that serves to highlight how unreasonable you're being by having boundaries in the first place. But I held firm. When Tommy needed money for a security deposit, I suggested he ask his father. When Dana wanted help with Christmas shopping, I recommended she try that budgeting app she was always telling me about. When Michael's girlfriend needed somewhere to stay again, I mentioned several affordable hotels in her price range. Each refusal felt like lifting a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Each no created space for something I'd nearly forgotten existed. My own wants, my own needs, my own sense of what I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. But the real test came when Dana decided to escalate. It was a Tuesday evening in November, cold and crisp with the promise of Chicago winter, when she showed up at my door with reinforcements. Robert was with her, looking uncomfortable but determined, and Michael trailed behind them with the resigned expression of someone who'd been conscripted into family drama against his better judgment. "We need to talk, Mom," Dana said without preamble as I opened the door. She pushed past me into my small living room, Robert and Michael following like reluctant conspirators. I closed the door and turned to face them. 3 adult children staging an intervention for my inconvenient self-respect. Dana had clearly prepared for this moment. She'd armed herself with examples of my concerning behavior, the refused loans, the declined requests for help, the general lack of enthusiasm for being everyone's personal ATM. "We're worried about you," she began, settling into my armchair like she owned it. "The way you've been acting lately, it's not like you. You've always been so generous, so giving, and now what?" I asked calmly. "Now you're different, cold, selfish. It's like you don't care about your family anymore. Selfish. After 50 years of putting their needs before my own, after selling my mother's jewelry to fund their vacation, after working double shifts to pay for their educations, I was being called selfish for finally saying no." Robert leaned forward with the kind of concerned expression he'd perfected during our marriage for managing my more unreasonable requests. "Maggie, we just want to understand what's changed. You've always been there for the kids, always willing to help when they needed it. This withdrawal from family life, it's not healthy. Withdrawal from family life, as if refusing to bankroll their adventures constituted abandoning them entirely." Michael, to his credit, looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. "Mom, we're not trying to attack you. We just, We miss the way things used to be. The way things used to be. When I was useful. When I said yes to everything. When I was grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. The way things used to be, I repeated slowly, wasn't working for me. Dana's composure cracked slightly. What's that supposed to mean? We've always been a close family. We've always been there for each other. Have we? The question came out sharper than I'd intended. Because from where I sit, it feels like I've been there for all of you, and you've been there for my checkbook. That's not fair, Mom, Michael protested. We love you. Money has nothing to do with it, doesn't it? I looked around at their faces. Dana's indignant, Robert's patronizing, Michael's genuinely confused. When's the last time any of you called me just to talk? When's the last time you invited me somewhere that didn't require me to pay for it? When's the last time you thanked me for something I did instead of taking credit for it yourselves? Silence. The kind of silence that follows a question no one wants to answer because the answer proves the point being made. Dana recovered first, her face flushing with the righteous anger of someone whose worldview is being challenged. I can't believe you're keeping score like this. That's not what family is about. What is family about then? I asked. Because I'd genuinely like to know. Because the way I've experienced it lately, family seems to be about me giving and you taking and everyone pretending that's normal. You're being ridiculous, Dana snapped. Nobody forced you to pay for that trip. Nobody forced you to help with mortgage payments or car loans or anything else. You offered. You wanted to help. I did want to help. I wanted to help because I love you. But help is supposed to be appreciated, not expected. And it's supposed to be acknowledged, not claimed by someone else. Robert sighed with the weary patience of someone dealing with a difficult child. Maggie, this is exactly what we're talking about. This keeping track of who did what, this demand for credit and recognition. It's not like you. Maybe it should be like me, I said quietly. Maybe I should have been keeping track all along. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the conversation, by the emotional labor of explaining why I deserved basic respect from my own family. I think you should all go now, I said. Dana's eyes widened with shock and something that might have been genuine hurt. Mom, we came here because we're worried about you, because we love you and want to help. If you love me, I said, then love me enough to respect my decisions. Love me enough to acknowledge my contributions. Love me enough to see me as a person instead of a resource. Michael stood up slowly, clearly ready to escape the uncomfortable conversation. Maybe we should all take some time to think about this. Good idea, I agreed. Take all the time you need. They filed out of my apartment with the stunned confusion of people who'd expected a different outcome entirely. Dana lingered at the door, looking like she wanted to say something else, but I was already closing it behind them. Alone again, I leaned against the door and felt the familiar mixture of liberation and panic that comes with burning bridges you've spent a lifetime building. But I'd done it. I'd finally said the things I'd been thinking for years. I'd finally stood up for myself instead of apologizing for wanting to be treated with dignity. Now I had to figure out what came next. The silence that followed was different from the loneliness I'd grown accustomed to over the years. This was chosen silence, purchased with courage instead of received as punishment. It felt clean in a way that surprised me. Days passed without contact from any of them, and I began to realize how much energy I'd been spending on managing their emotions, anticipating their needs, walking on eggshells to maintain family peace. Without that constant tension, my apartment felt larger, quieter, more like a home than a waiting room. I started doing things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. I read books without interruption. I took long baths without worrying about missing important phone calls. I bought groceries for myself alone and marveled at how little space my actual needs required in the shopping cart. One evening, while sorting through old papers, I found the business card for the lawyer Mrs. Ramirez had mentioned months ago. Sarah Chen, it read, specializing in elder law and estate planning. I'd tucked it away thinking I might need it someday for simple will updates, but now I wondered if there were other ways she might be able to help. The next morning, I called her office. Sarah Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably around Dana's age, with kind eyes and the kind of professional competence that makes you feel heard rather than managed. Her office in downtown Chicago was modest but comfortable, with photographs of families and certificates on the walls that suggested both experience and success. "Mrs. Patterson," she said after I'd explained my situation, "what you're describing is unfortunately very common. Financial exploitation of elderly family members often goes unrecognized because it looks like family generosity from the outside. But I gave willingly," I said. "I wasn't forced to help with anything." "Coercion doesn't have to be obvious to be effective," she replied gently. "Emotional manipulation, guilt, isolation, these can be just as powerful as outright threats. The fact that you're here suggests you've started to recognize that something wasn't right about the dynamic." She explained options I hadn't known existed, ways to protect my remaining assets, legal tools for ensuring my wishes would be respected, resources for older adults who felt financially vulnerable in family relationships. For the first time in months, I felt like someone was taking my concerns seriously instead of trying to talk me out of them. "What would you recommend?" I asked. "First, we secure what you have left. Set up accounts that can't be accessed by anyone but you. Establish clear legal boundaries around your financial assets. Then we work on estate planning that reflects your actual wishes rather than what others might expect from you." "And if my children contest any of it?" Sarah Chen smiled with the confidence of someone who'd handled similar situations many times before. "Let them. You have every right to control your own money while you're alive, and to distribute it as you see fit after you're gone. Family relationships don't entitle anyone to your financial support." I left her office 2 hours later with a folder full of documents and a plan that felt like armor. For the first time in years, my money was truly mine again. But the real test came a week later, when Dana called with news that cut straight to the heart of everything I'd been struggling with. "Mom," she said, her voice bright with excitement, "I have amazing news. You know that promotion I've been hoping for? I got it. And to celebrate, I want to plan another family trip. Somewhere really special this time. I was thinking maybe Europe. I found this incredible tour package that would be perfect for all of us." Europe. The dream vacation I'd fantasized about for decades, but never been able to afford. The once-in-a-lifetime experience that my mother's generation had never had the opportunity to take. "That sounds wonderful," I said carefully. "How are you planning to pay for it?" "Well, I thought we could do the same thing we did for Door County. Pool our resources, make it a real family investment. I've already looked into the costs, and I think if we all contribute, meaning if I contribute while she takes credit." "Dana," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded, "I won't be able to help pay for a trip like that." Silence. Then a laugh that sounded forced. "Mom, this is Europe we're talking about. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You can't tell me you don't want to see Paris or Rome or—" "I would love to see Paris and Rome," I interrupted, "but I won't be paying for the privilege of watching you take credit for making it possible." The silence that followed was different, deeper, more shocked. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dana said finally. "Yes, you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Just like you knew exactly what you were doing at Door County when you let everyone thank you for a trip you didn't pay for. I organized everything. With my money from my mother's necklace, which I sold so we could have that experience together. And instead of being acknowledged as a contributor, I got to sit there watching everyone praise you for your generosity." Dana's voice shifted, becoming measured and careful. "Mom, we've talked about this. You're fixating on something that isn't. I'm fixating on the truth, and the truth is that I'm done financing experiences that I get no credit for. I'm done being useful while being invisible. I'm done pretending that being taken advantage of is the same thing as being loved." When Dana spoke again, her voice had gone cold. "I see. So this is what it's really about. You want people to know you have money. You want credit for writing checks. You want to be thanked for doing what any loving mother would do. I want to be respected by my own children. I want my contributions to be acknowledged. I want to be treated like a person instead of a bank account with emotions. And if we don't do that, if we don't perform gratitude to your satisfaction, then you'll just cut us off? Withdraw your love because we don't appreciate your money the way you want us to?" The accusation hit exactly where it was meant to hit. That soft place where my love for my children lived alongside my desperate fear of losing them entirely. For a moment, I felt the old familiar urge to apologize, to back down, to accept whatever crumbs of affection they were willing to offer in exchange for continued financial support. But then I remembered Sarah Chen's words. Family relationships don't entitle anyone to your financial support. And I remembered my mother's necklace, sold to fund a vacation where I was made invisible, and I felt that steel in my spine again. This isn't about withdrawing my love, Dana. This is about withdrawing my financing. I will always love you, but I won't always pay for the privilege. I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding with the terrifying freedom of having finally said what needed to be said. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with messages from Michael and Tommy, both expressing shock and disappointment at my ultimatum. The family group chat, the one I'd been added to but rarely participated in, suddenly came alive with discussions of my behavior and concerns about my mental state. Robert called to suggest I was having some kind of breakdown and needed professional help immediately. "This isn't like you, Maggie," he said with the kind of gentle firmness reserved for managing crisis situations. "The children are worried sick. Worried sick. About losing their access to my bank account, more likely." But the cruelest blow came from an unexpected source. I was having coffee with my neighbor, Mrs. Ramirez, a few days after the phone call with Dana, grateful for her steady presence and lack of judgment, when she gently brought up something she'd seen online. "Mija," she said carefully, "I don't like to get involved in family business, but I think you should know. Your daughter. She posted something on that Facebook. About you." My stomach dropped. "What kind of something?" Mrs. Ramirez hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. She's saying you're not well, that you've been acting strange, making unreasonable demands, pushing family away. She's asking people to keep you in their prayers during this difficult time." Public humiliation, the final weapon in Dana's arsenal. Not content with taking credit for my sacrifices, she was now publicly painting me as mentally unstable for refusing to continue making them. I asked Mrs. Ramirez to show me the post on her phone, and there it was. A carefully crafted message that managed to sound loving and concerned while painting me as a difficult elderly woman who was struggling with some challenges and pushing away the people who love her most. The comments were full of sympathy for Dana's situation and prayers for my recovery from whatever was causing my unreasonable behavior. Friends and acquaintances who'd known me for years were publicly discussing my apparent mental decline and offering support to my devoted daughter, who was handling such a difficult situation with such grace. I stared at the screen, watching my reputation dissolve in real time, and realized this was what happened when you stopped being useful. This was the price of dignity, being labeled as difficult, unstable, demanding. This was how loving families dealt with members who stopped accepting their assigned roles. For a moment, the old panic rose in my chest, the urge to call Dana, to apologize, to promise to be more reasonable if she'd just take down that post and restore my standing in our social circle. The fear of being alone overwhelming the desire to be respected. But then I looked at Mrs. Ramirez's kind face, full of concern and understanding, and I realized something important. The people who truly knew me, who'd watched me struggle and sacrifice and give everything I had to a family that took me for granted, those people wouldn't believe Dana's version of events. And the people who did believe it without question weren't really my friends anyway. "Let them talk," I said finally, handing the phone back to Mrs. Ramirez. "Let them all talk." That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. I pulled out my laptop, the one Tommy had helped me choose 3 Christmases ago, and created my own social media post. Not a response to Dana's accusations, not a defense of my behavior, but something else entirely. I wrote about my mother's necklace. I wrote about the woman who'd worn it through the Depression, who'd kept it through decades of hardship, who'd saved it to pass down to her daughter as a symbol of enduring value. I wrote about selling it to fund a family vacation, about watching my daughter take credit for my sacrifice, about the slow realization that love shouldn't require erasure. I wrote about the difference between being useful and being valued, between buying affection and earning respect, between family obligation and family love. I didn't mention Dana by name. I didn't respond to her accusations or defend my mental state. I simply told my truth, quietly and clearly, and let people draw their own conclusions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments poured in from people sharing their own stories of family exploitation, their own struggles with adult children who took more than they gave, their own journeys toward self-respect after years of being taken for granted. Women my age and older reached out with messages of support and understanding, many sharing remarkably similar experiences. "Thank you for saying what so many of us have felt," wrote one woman. "I thought I was the only one." "Your courage gives me hope," wrote another. "I've been making excuses for my family's behavior for so long. I almost forgot I had the right to stop." The public conversation that had started with Dana's attempt to shame me evolved into something larger. A discussion about the expectations placed on older family members, about the difference between generosity and exploitation, about the right of parents to set boundaries with adult children who'd learned to see love as an entitlement. I'd accidentally started a movement by simply telling the truth about my life, but the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Tommy showed up at my door 3 days after my post went viral, looking sheepish and carrying a small potted plant. Not flowers, which would have been a gesture, but a living thing that required ongoing care and attention. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, "can we talk?" I let him in, curious about what he'd come to say. Of all my children, Tommy had been the quietest during the recent family drama, participating without leading, following without enthusiastic agreement. He settled into my armchair, the same one Dana had claimed during their intervention attempt, and looked around my apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. "I read your post," he said finally. And I think I owe you an apology." "Actually, I know I do. We all do." The admission caught me off guard. I'd grown so accustomed to having my perspective dismissed that hearing it validated by one of my children felt surreal. "Tommy, you don't—" "Yes, I do. Mom, when I read about your mother's necklace, about how you sold it for that trip and then had to watch Dana take all the credit, I felt sick, really sick, because I knew it was true, and I knew I'd just stood there and let it happen." He leaned forward, his young face serious in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. "I remember that necklace. I remember you showing it to me when I was little, telling me stories about Grandma wearing it to church every Sunday. And you sold it for us, and we didn't even notice. You were enjoying yourselves," I said gently. "That's what I wanted. But at what cost? Mom, you've been taking care of all of us for our entire lives, and somehow we convinced ourselves that was just normal, that you existed to solve our problems and fund our dreams, and ask nothing in return." Tommy ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd made since childhood when he was trying to work through complicated thoughts. "The thing is, I don't think we even realized we were doing it. It just became this pattern, you know? Tommy needs money for rent. Call Mom. Dana wants to organize something expensive. Mom will contribute. Mike's car breaks down. Mom can help. We turned you into this resource that was always available, always reliable, always willing." "I was willing," I said. "I loved helping you when you needed it. But we started taking it for granted. And worse than that, we started taking you for granted. When's the last time any of us asked how you were doing? Not how you were doing with money or whether you could help with something, but just how you were doing." The question hung between us, unanswered because we both knew the answer. "I should have noticed," Tommy continued. "After Dad left, after we all moved out, you just kept giving, and we just kept taking. And when you finally said enough, instead of examining our own behavior, we decided you were the problem." He stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the Chicago skyline that had been the backdrop to my entire adult life. "Dana's post, about you being difficult and unreasonable. Mom, that wasn't right. That was cruel. And I should have said something. I should have defended you instead of just staying quiet and hoping the whole thing would blow over." The apology I'd been waiting years to hear was finally being spoken, and I found myself crying without realizing I'd started. "But the worst part," Tommy said, turning back to face me, "is that I think part of us actually believed it. That you wanting acknowledgement for your sacrifices was somehow selfish. That you asking to be treated with respect was demanding too much. We'd gotten so used to you being selfless that we forgot you were supposed to be a person too. He came back to the chair and sat down, really looking at me for the first time in the conversation. I want to do better, Mom. I want to learn how to have a relationship with you that isn't about what you can do for me. I want to appreciate you for who you are, not just what you provide. I don't know exactly how to do that. I've gotten pretty used to the old way, but I want to try. It wasn't a complete transformation. It wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect from now on. But it was acknowledgement and recognition and the beginning of something that felt more like authentic love than anything I'd experienced from my children in years. I'd like that too, I said. Tommy smiled, and for a moment he looked like the little boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, who trusted me to make everything better with hugs and stories and patience. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. What made you finally say no? After all these years of saying yes to everything, what changed? I thought about it, trying to identify the exact moment when accommodation became resistance, when love became self-respect. I realized I was disappearing, I said finally. Not just my money, but me. My contributions, my sacrifices, my presence, all of it was being absorbed into other people's stories about themselves. I became invisible in my own life, and I realized that if I didn't fight for my right to exist, no one else was going to do it for me. Tommy nodded slowly, processing this in the thoughtful way he'd inherited from my side of the family. For what it's worth, he said, you're the most visible you've been in years. That post you wrote, the way you stood up to all of us, the boundaries you're setting, it's like you're finally taking up space again instead of just existing in the spaces other people leave for you. It was the most insightful thing any of my children had said to me in decades, and it came from the one I'd always thought was the least introspective. There's something else, Tommy said as he prepared to leave. Dana and Mike, they're not ready to hear this yet. They're still angry, still convinced that you're the one who's being unreasonable. But I think eventually they'll come around. This can't be the end of our family. It doesn't have to be the end, I agreed. But it does have to be different. After Tommy left, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not hope that my children would go back to needing me in the old ways, but hope that we might find new ways to love each other that didn't require anyone's disappearance. It was a beginning. Over the following weeks, Tommy made good on his promise to be different. He called regularly, not to ask for anything but simply to talk. He remembered my birthday. Not with expensive gifts I might have helped fund, but with a homemade card and a visit that was purely about spending time together. He started paying attention to my life in ways that surprised both of us. He noticed when I mentioned taking an art class and asked to see the paintings I'd been working on. He remembered stories I told about my childhood and asked follow-up questions at later visits. He treated me like someone whose thoughts and experiences were worth knowing, not just someone whose resources were worth accessing. It was a small transformation, but it felt revolutionary. The art classes had become my refuge during the worst of the family conflict. Every Tuesday evening, I drove to a community center in Lincoln Square and spent 2 hours with a group of mostly older adults who were rediscovering creativity after decades of other priorities. Our instructor, Margaret, was a former high school art teacher in her 70s, who treated our tentative efforts with the same seriousness she'd once brought to teenage masterpieces. She taught us to see light differently, to understand that shadows weren't the absence of something, but the presence of contrast and depth. Art, she said during one particularly meaningful class, is about making visible what was always there but never noticed. I thought about that phrase constantly during those difficult months. Making visible what was always there but never noticed. It seemed to describe exactly what I'd been trying to do. Not create something new, but reveal something that had been overlooked. My paintings weren't sophisticated or technically accomplished, but they were mine in a way that nothing had been mine for years. The colors I chose, the subjects I focused on, the emotions I tried to capture, all of it came from a part of me that had been dormant so long I'd forgotten it existed. I painted the view from my apartment window at different times of day, tracking the way Chicago light changed with the seasons. I painted my hands, older now, marked by years of work and worry, but still capable of creating something beautiful. I painted my mother's necklace from memory, trying to capture not just its appearance, but the weight of all it had represented. Margaret encouraged us to share our work with each other, and I was amazed by the stories that emerged. Ruth, a widow in her 80s, painted portraits of her late husband that grew more vibrant as she processed her grief. Frank, a retired mechanic, created abstract compositions that somehow captured the rhythm and energy of the machines he'd spent 40 years repairing. We were a community of people reclaiming parts of ourselves that had been set aside for practicality, rediscovering voices we'd thought we'd lost. But the real breakthrough came during a class in December, when Margaret asked us to paint something that represented transformation. I stared at the blank canvas for 20 minutes, overwhelmed by the possibilities. So much had changed in my life over the past year: my relationship with my children, my understanding of my own worth, my willingness to prioritize my own needs. How do you paint personal revolution? Then I remembered a moment from earlier that week. I'd been walking through Millennium Park, taking advantage of an unusually warm December afternoon, when I'd noticed a tree that had lost all its leaves but was still standing tall and strong against the winter sky. Not broken by the seasonal change, but revealed by it. Its true structure was visible now that all the decorative foliage had fallen away. I painted that tree, but as I worked, it became something more than botanical observation. The bare branches reaching toward the sky became arms raised in celebration or defiance or simple acknowledgement of continuing existence. The strong trunk became the spine of someone who'd finally learned to stand straight after years of bending under the weight of other people's expectations. When I finished, I realized I'd painted a self-portrait without painting myself. Margaret stood behind me, studying the canvas with the thoughtful attention she brought to all our work. "This is powerful, Maggie," she said finally. "Most people paint transformation as addition, something new being added to what was already there. But you've painted it as revelation, something that was always present becoming visible." After class, driving home through the familiar streets of Chicago, I thought about revelation versus transformation. Maybe the changes in my life weren't about becoming someone new, but about becoming someone I'd always been but had forgotten how to be. The woman who sold her mother's necklace and then sat silently while someone else took credit for her sacrifice. That hadn't been my true self. That had been my accommodating self, my people-pleasing self, my desperate-to-be-loved self. The woman who set boundaries and demanded acknowledgement and painted bare trees as symbols of strength. That felt more authentic, more aligned with the person I'd been before I'd learned to disappear for the convenience of others. Christmas approached with unusual complexity. For the first time in years, I wasn't being asked to host or fund or coordinate family celebrations. The silence where those expectations used to live felt simultaneously freeing and lonely. Dana hadn't spoken to me since our phone conversation about the Europe trip. Michael maintained minimal contact, brief, polite messages that said nothing meaningful and requested nothing specific. Only Tommy continued to engage with the new version of me, the one with boundaries and self-respect. Part of me missed the familiar stress of Christmas planning, the exhausting but purposeful work of trying to create perfect memories for people who took that work for granted. At least when I was useful, I was included. At least when I was giving everything, I was wanted. But another part of me was curious about what Christmas might look like when it wasn't built around my obligation to make everyone else happy. Mrs. Ramirez invited me to join her family's celebration, and I was touched by the genuine warmth of the invitation. "My grandchildren would love to meet their abuela's friend," she said. "And you shouldn't be alone on Christmas." I almost said yes. The prospect of being surrounded by multi-generational love, even borrowed love, was deeply appealing. But something made me hesitate. "That's incredibly kind," I said. "But I think I might try something different this year." What I tried was something I'd never done in my entire adult life. I spent Christmas exactly the way I wanted to spend it. I woke up late and made myself an elaborate breakfast, the kind with multiple courses and garnishes I never bothered with when I was cooking for others. I opened gifts I'd bought for myself: art supplies, books, a soft robe that felt like an indulgence. I called my sister in Portland, the one I rarely talked to because family obligations usually consumed all my emotional energy. We had a long, meandering conversation about our childhoods, our parents, the paths our lives had taken. In the afternoon, I went to my art studio, my kitchen table transformed with easels and palettes and canvases, and painted, not for anyone else, not as a gift or a demonstration or a way to be useful, just for the pure pleasure of creation. As evening approached, I realized I felt something I couldn't remember experiencing on Christmas before: contentment. Not the frantic relief of having successfully managed everyone else's happiness, but the quiet satisfaction of having honored my own needs and desires. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was peaceful in a way that had nothing to do with other people's approval. That night, as I sat by my window watching snow begin to fall over Chicago, I understood something fundamental about the difference between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness was what I'd felt at family gatherings where I was present but invisible, useful but unappreciated, necessary but not valued. Solitude was what I felt now, complete, self-contained, connected to myself in ways that made connection with others possible but not desperate. The revelation changed everything. January brought unexpected news. Tommy called with information he'd been reluctant to share. Dana and Michael were planning to contest my will. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," he said, his voice tight with stress. "But I thought you should know. They've been talking to lawyers about your diminished capacity. They think if they can prove you're not mentally competent, they can challenge any changes you've made to your estate planning." I felt a familiar spike of anxiety, followed by something newer and steadier: resolve. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them they were being ridiculous. That there's nothing wrong with your mind except you finally started using it to protect yourself instead of enable them." Tommy's support meant everything, but I knew he was just one voice against a chorus of family members who decided my self-respect was evidence of mental decline. "Will you testify on their behalf?" I asked, needing to know the worst-case scenario. "Mom," Tommy said, his voice heavy with disappointment that I'd even asked, "I would never do that. If this goes to court, I'll testify about what I've observed, that you're healthier and more clear-thinking now than you've been in years." That afternoon, I called Sarah Chen. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again," she said when I explained the situation. "This is exactly why we put those protections in place. Your children have every right to contest your will, but they'll have to prove their case in court. And from what I observed during our meetings, you're one of the most mentally competent clients I've worked with." She explained the process, the evidence that would be required, the likelihood of success for challenges based on diminished capacity. "The good news," she said, "is that you've been building a record of competent decision-making. The art classes, the social media post, the thoughtful way you've handled family conflicts, all of that demonstrates mental clarity and emotional intelligence. And the bad news? The bad news is that family legal battles are emotionally devastating, even when you win. Are you prepared for that level of conflict with your children?" I thought about it for a long moment, weighing the cost of fighting against the cost of surrender. "I'm prepared," I said finally. "I've been surrendering my dignity to keep peace with them for years, and it didn't work. Maybe it's time to fight for it instead." But the legal battle never materialized the way we expected. Instead, something remarkable happened. The online conversation that had started with my post about my mother's necklace continued to grow and evolve. Other older adults began sharing their stories, creating a virtual community of people who'd experienced similar family exploitation. A journalist from the Chicago Tribune reached out, wanting to write about the trend of adult children financially exploiting their aging parents. She interviewed me, along with several other people who'd found the courage to set boundaries with family members who'd learned to see them as resources rather than people. The article ran on a Sunday in February, and by Monday morning, my phone was ringing with calls from radio shows, podcasts, and television producers who wanted to explore the topic further. "You've become something of an accidental spokesperson," Sarah Chen told me during one of our check-ins. "People are responding to your story because it reflects experiences many of them have had, but never talked about publicly." The media attention had an unexpected side effect. It made my children's legal threats look vindictive rather than protective. It's difficult to argue that someone is mentally incapacitated when they're being interviewed as an expert on national television about elder abuse and family exploitation. More importantly, the public conversation was shifting the narrative around family obligations and parental boundaries. What had once been seen as selfish or unreasonable, older adults refusing to bankroll their adult children's lifestyles, was beginning to be recognized as healthy and appropriate. I appeared on 3 podcasts, 2 radio shows, and 1 morning television program, always emphasizing that the issue wasn't about money, but about respect, acknowledgement, and the right to be valued as a person rather than just a provider. The saddest part, I told a reporter from the Sun-Times, isn't that my children took my contributions for granted. It's that they taught me to take them for granted too. I spent so many years believing that being useful was the same as being loved that I forgot I deserved both. The quote was picked up by social media and shared thousands of times, often with comments from people expressing gratitude for words that articulated feelings they'd carried, but never been able to express. But the real breakthrough came in March, when Dana finally broke her months-long silence. She showed up at my door on a Thursday evening, looking tired and uncertain in ways I hadn't seen since she was a child. Gone was the confident hostess who'd orchestrated our Door County weekend, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely shaken by the public attention our family drama had attracted. "Mom," she said when I opened the door, "we need to talk." I let her in, curious about what she'd come to say. The last time we'd been in the same room, she'd been staging an intervention for my inconvenient self-respect. Now she sat in my living room looking smaller, less sure of herself, more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. "I've been watching the interviews," she said finally. "Reading the articles, seeing the comments from people who say they've experienced similar things with their families." She paused, seeming to struggle with something difficult. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Not mom honest, where you say what you think I want to hear. Really honest. Okay? Do you really think I've been exploiting you? Taking advantage of your generosity? Because that's not how I see it. That's not what I thought was happening." The question was asked with genuine confusion, not defensive anger. It was the first time since this whole conflict began that Dana seemed to be approaching it with curiosity rather than certainty. "I think," I said carefully, "that you learned to see my financial support as normal, expected, unlimited, and when that became your baseline, my contributions became invisible. But I never asked you to sell your mother's necklace for that trip. I didn't even know you'd done that until I read your post. You didn't ask me to sell it specifically, but when you presented the trip as something you were organizing and paying for, while privately expecting me to cover the costs, what choice did I have? Either fund your vision or be excluded from family experiences." Dana was quiet for a long time, processing this in ways I could see playing out across her face. "I didn't think of it like that," she said finally. "I thought I was being helpful by organizing everything. I thought I was taking the burden off you by handling all the planning and logistics. The planning was helpful. The taking credit for my financial contributions wasn't. But I didn't think I was taking credit. I was proud of having put together such a special weekend for everyone. It felt like my accomplishment, because I'd done all the work." "Dana, what work costs more? Researching hotels and making reservations, or earning the money to pay for them?" The question hung between us, simple and devastating. "The money," she said quietly. "Of course the money costs more. God, Mom, I'm 43 years old and I just realized I've been thinking about your financial contributions like they're just something that happens. Like they appear out of nowhere instead of coming from your work and your sacrifices." It wasn't a complete apology, but it was recognition. For the first time, Dana was seeing our family dynamic from my perspective instead of just her own. "When I was growing up," she continued, "you just handled everything. Money for school clothes, college tuition, help when I needed it. It all seemed effortless. I think I convinced myself it was easy for you, that you had unlimited resources instead of limited savings you were sharing with us. It was never easy," I said gently, "but I wanted you to think it was. I wanted you to feel secure and supported, not guilty about the cost. But by hiding the cost from us, you taught us not to see it. And if we couldn't see it, we couldn't appreciate it properly. Dana stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the courtyard where spring was just beginning to show itself in small green shoots pushing through the winter-hard ground. The thing is, I've been telling everyone that you changed, that you became different, demanding, unreasonable, but really you just became visible. You started insisting that your contributions be acknowledged instead of absorbed into other people's stories about their own generosity. She turned back to face me, and I could see she'd been crying. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I took credit for sacrifices you made. I'm sorry I made you feel invisible in your own family. I'm sorry it took public humiliation for me to see what I was doing to you. It was the apology I'd been waiting for, but it felt more complicated than I'd imagined it would. Relief mixed with sadness, vindication tempered by recognition of how much had been lost along the way. I accept your apology, I said, but I need you to understand that this can't go back to the way it was. I can't go back to being useful without being respected. I know. I don't want it to go back to the way it was either. I want to learn how to have a relationship with you that isn't built on what you can provide for me. That might be more difficult than you think. It means no more loans you can't repay. No more expensive plans that somehow require my financial participation. No more taking credit for things I contribute to. Dana nodded, accepting terms that would have seemed outrageous to her just months before. I understand. And Mom? About that legal challenge Michael and I were discussing. That's over. We're dropping any plans to contest your will or challenge your competency. What we were considering, it was wrong. It was exactly the kind of exploitation you've been talking about. What changed your mind? Honestly, the media attention made me see how it would look to outsiders. But more than that, talking to you now, seeing how clear and thoughtful you are about all this, I can't pretend you're mentally incompetent when you're obviously more mentally healthy than you've been in years. It was a small victory, but an important one. The legal threat that had been hanging over me for months dissolved with a few sentences of acknowledgement and respect. But the bigger victory was the conversation itself. For the first time in years, Dana and I were talking to each other as equals rather than as provider and recipient, as two adults working through a complicated relationship rather than as mother and child locked in patterns of expectation and resentment. It wasn't a complete transformation. That would take time and consistent effort from both of us. But it was a beginning, a foundation for something that might eventually become the authentic family connection I'd been longing for. Dana left that evening with promises to stay in touch, to make different choices, to build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided support. Whether those promises would be kept remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about the possibility. Not hopeful that things would go back to the old way. I never wanted that again. But hopeful that they might evolve into something better than they'd ever been before. The changes continued gradually over the following months. Dana did stay in touch, calling regularly with conversations that weren't requests for help or updates about problems I might be asked to solve. Michael remained more distant, still processing his own role in our family dynamics. But his communications became more respectful even if they weren't yet warm. Tommy continued to be my strongest ally, bringing his girlfriend around to meet me, including me in their plans in ways that felt genuine rather than obligatory. He was learning how to be a son rather than a dependent, and I was learning how to be a mother rather than a provider. The art classes became so important to me that I enrolled in advanced sessions, pushing myself to try techniques I'd never imagined learning. My paintings grew more confident, more expressive, more willing to take creative risks. Margaret, our instructor, pulled me aside after a particularly successful class in May. "Maggie," she said, "I've been teaching art for 40 years, and I've never seen a transformation like yours. When you started, you were painting like you were afraid of taking up too much space on the canvas. Now you paint like you understand you have every right to fill it completely. Fill the space completely. Not apologize for existing, not minimize my presence, not fade into backgrounds painted by other people. Fill the space completely with colors and shapes and thoughts and feelings that were genuinely mine. I think I've been learning to take up space in all areas of my life," I told her. "It shows in your work. And if I may say so, It shows in the rest of you, too. That summer, I did something I'd dreamed about for decades but never thought was possible. I planned my own trip to Europe. Not a family vacation where I'd be expected to pay but not organize. Not a group experience where my presence would be tolerated as long as my checkbook was accessible. A solo adventure designed entirely around my own interests and preferences. I spent weeks researching art museums in Paris, planning walking tours through Rome, booking small hotels in places I'd only seen in books. Every detail was chosen by me, for me, without having to accommodate anyone else's schedule or budget or expectations. The trip was everything I'd imagined and more. I stood in front of paintings I'd admired in reproduction for years, feeling the texture of brushstrokes and the power of creativity that had survived centuries. I walked through cities where history lived in every stone, where art and beauty were valued as essential elements of human experience. But the most meaningful moment came in a small cafe in Florence, where I was sketching the view from my table while drinking wine that cost more than I would have spent on groceries in the old days. A younger woman at the next table struck up a conversation, asking about my drawings. "Are you an artist?" she asked. "I'm learning to be," I replied. "How wonderful. It's never too late to discover your gifts, is it?" "No," I agreed, thinking about all the years I'd spent convinced that my only gifts were financial and domestic. All the time I'd lost believing that creativity was a luxury I couldn't afford. It's never too late. I sent postcards to my children, not asking how they were, not updating them on family concerns, just sharing beautiful images and brief thoughts about the places I was seeing. Tommy wrote back enthusiastically, asking questions about my itinerary and experiences. Dana sent polite responses that seemed genuinely interested rather than obligatory. Michael didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The postcards weren't about maintaining connections, but about celebrating my independence. When I returned to Chicago 2 weeks later, I felt like a different person, not because travel had changed me, but because I'd discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten they existed. Mrs. Ramirez met me at my door with a plate of homemade tamales and eager questions about my adventure. As we sat in my kitchen looking through hundreds of photos, she made an observation that stayed with me. "Mija," she said, "you look like yourself again. Not the tired version I've known for the past few years, but the real version, the one who was hiding underneath all that worry and sadness. The real version, the woman who'd been buried under decades of other people's expectations, who'd been excavated through months of conflict and boundary setting, who'd finally been polished bright enough to shine again." That fall, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold my apartment and bought a small house. Not a house that would accommodate family gatherings or provide guest rooms for visiting children. A house sized for one person who was finally comfortable taking up exactly the amount of space she needed. No more and no less. The house was in Hyde Park, near the university, with large windows that filled rooms with light perfect for painting. It had a small garden where I could grow herbs and flowers, a front porch where I could sit with coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up each morning. For the first time in my adult life, I was making housing decisions based on my own preferences rather than my family's needs. The freedom of it felt intoxicating. The house became my sanctuary and my studio, my refuge and my launching pad for new adventures. I hosted art classes for other older adults, sharing techniques I'd learned and encouraging creativity in people who'd been told they weren't artistic. I started a small blog about late-life liberation, sharing thoughts about self-respect and boundary setting that resonated with readers around the world. The community that had started with my social media post continued to grow, creating connections between people who'd felt isolated in their struggles with family expectations. But the most significant change was internal. The constant low-level anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my adult life, worry about money, about family harmony, about whether I was doing enough for the people I loved, had been replaced by something else: contentment. Not the contentment of resignation, where you accept unsatisfying circumstances because changing them seems impossible. The contentment of alignment, where your life reflects your values and your choices serve your authentic self rather than other people's expectations. I was finally living my own life instead of existing in the margins of everyone else's. A year after our confrontation in my apartment doorway, Dana called with an invitation that represented everything that had changed between us. "Mom," she said, "I want to take you to dinner. My treat, my planning, my way of saying thank you for everything you've given me over the years. Would Saturday work?" A year earlier, those words would have been exactly what I wanted to hear. Now they were even better because they came from a place of recognition rather than obligation, gratitude rather than guilt. "I'd love that," I said. She chose a restaurant in River North, elegant but not excessive, special enough to mark the occasion without being financially irresponsible. When I arrived, she was already seated at our table, looking nervous in the way people do when they're about to have important conversations. "This is beautiful," I said, settling into my chair and looking around at the candle-lit room. "I wanted it to be special," she replied. "I wanted to do something that honored what you've meant to me, what you've given me, without asking you to pay for the privilege of being honored." It was exactly the right thing to say, acknowledgement that showed she understood both the old dynamic and the new boundaries. Over dinner, we talked about her work, my art classes, her children's school activities, my travel plans. Normal family conversation, but with a quality I couldn't remember experiencing before. Balance. She asked about my life with genuine interest, not as a prelude to requests for assistance. I inquired about her challenges without offering to solve them financially. As dessert arrived, Dana pulled out an envelope and handed it to me. "This isn't much," she said, "but I wanted to give you something that belonged to you." Inside was a check made out to me, along with a photograph I recognized immediately. My mother wearing her pearl necklace on her wedding day, young and radiant and full of hopes for the future. "I can't give you back the original necklace," Dana said, "but I can give you back the money you got for it. With interest, because it's taken me this long to realize what you sacrificed." The check was for exactly the amount I'd received at the pawn shop, plus additional money that represented what the necklace would have been worth to a collector who understood its true value. "Dana, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. That necklace represented your mother's love for you, and you sold it to show love for us. The least I can do is make sure you didn't lose financially on the transaction." I looked at the photograph, seeing my mother as she'd been at 22, wearing jewelry that would survive the Depression and 2 wars and decades of careful preservation before being sacrificed for a family vacation in Door County. "There's something else," Dana said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small velvet box that made my heart stop. Inside was a necklace, not my mother's original, but something new and beautiful, with pearls that caught the restaurant's soft lighting and small diamonds that sparkled like promises kept. "I can't replace what you sold," Dana said, "but I can give you something new to represent how much your sacrifices have meant to me, something you can pass down someday, knowing it came from love instead of obligation." The necklace was beautiful, but the gesture was what took my breath away. For the first time in our relationship, Dana had given me something costly, not just in money but in thought and recognition and acknowledgement of debt owed. "Will you help me put it on?" I asked. As Dana fastened the necklace around my neck, I felt my mother's presence in the moment. Not sadness for what had been lost, but joy for what had been found. 3 generations of women, connected by jewelry that represented love freely given rather than desperately purchased. "How does it look?" I asked. "It looks like it belongs there," Dana replied, and I could see in her eyes that she meant more than just the necklace. That evening, driving home through familiar Chicago streets with new pearls around my neck, and a daughter who'd finally learned to see me as a person rather than a provider, I realized that all the conflict and confrontation and painful boundary setting had been worth it for this moment. Not because everything was perfect now. Families are never perfect, and ours still had work to do, but because we'd found a way to love each other that honored everyone's dignity instead of requiring someone's disappearance. I was no longer invisible in my own family story. I was no longer a supporting character in other people's narratives of their own generosity. I was finally the protagonist of my own life, surrounded by people who could see me clearly enough to love me authentically. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. Now, sitting by the window in my Hyde Park house as another Chicago winter settles over the city, I look back on that journey from invisibility to recognition with gratitude for every difficult moment that led me here. Those months of conflict taught me the difference between being needed and being valued, between purchasing affection and earning respect, between accommodating others and honoring myself. They showed me that boundaries aren't barriers to love, but foundations for healthy relationships. The woman who sold her mother's necklace and then sat quietly while someone else took credit for her sacrifice. She was real, and her pain was valid, but she doesn't live here anymore. In her place is someone who takes up space unapologetically, who creates beauty for its own sake, who travels alone without loneliness and loves others without losing herself. My children are learning to know this version of me, some faster than others, all gradually discovering that respecting my boundaries doesn't diminish our relationships, but deepens them. My grandchildren are growing up seeing their grandmother as a person with interests and needs rather than just a resource with unlimited availability. The art classes continue. The blog grows. The community of people reclaiming their dignity after years of family exploitation expands every day. What started as one woman's desperate refusal to remain invisible has become a movement of older adults choosing self-respect over accommodation, authenticity over acceptance. But the most important change is the quietest one. I sleep peacefully now, not because all my problems are solved, but because I no longer carry the exhausting weight of everyone else's expectations. I wake up each morning curious about what I might discover, create, or experience that day. I am no longer disappearing in plain sight. I am present, visible, valued, first by myself, then by others who've learned that love without respect is just another word for exploitation. Have you ever lived or known someone who lived something like this? Have you found yourself disappearing into the needs of people who took your sacrifices for granted while taking credit for your contributions? Have you wondered what might happen if you finally said no, set boundaries, demanded the recognition you've earned through decades of selfless giving? Please, share your story in the comments. Your experience matters, your voice deserves to be heard, and your decision to reclaim your dignity might inspire someone else to begin their own journey from invisibility to recognition. If this story touched something in your heart, if it helped you see your own situation more clearly, if it gave you courage to take up the space you've always deserved, please like this video and subscribe. Stories like ours grow stronger when they're shared, and we all need to know we're not alone in the struggle to be seen as more than what we can provide for others. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for believing that our stories matter. Thank you for helping me remember that visibility isn't something we have to earn. It's something we have every right to claim.